Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Philosophy of Cognitive Science with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So today, what we're going to do is finish our lecture on the extended mind hypothesis. So basically, we'll just be doing a little bit of recap, going over the discussion section in Clarke's book, and I'm not going to talk about the dessert section. There's a section in chapter 9 of Clarke's book Mindware, which follows the discussion section. In the interest of just getting things done, I've decided not to look at that. But if any of you want to look at that section on your own and you have any questions about it, do reach out to me. So that's the plan for today. So let's get started with a little bit of recap. Last time, I introduced you all to what the extended mind hypothesis is all about. And also, we talked a little bit about what the extended mind hypothesis isn't as well. Basically, the extended mind hypothesis, according to Clarke and Chalmers, is a hypothesis about extended vehicles for mental states. And we're talking about a particular kind of mental state here. At least Clarke and Chalmers were in their 1998 publication. They were talking about mental states like dispositional beliefs. So it is possible to kind of apply the extended mind hypothesis broadly, as Clarke certainly does throughout the rest of the chapter, when he talks about lots of bioexternal loops or wideware, mindware, organism couplings and this kind of thing. But in the introduction of the theory, they kind of take a narrow scope. Clarke and Chalmers do, that is. So just keep that in mind. And a lot of the examples we covered were about, this kind of narrow version of the extended mind hypothesis, which concerned particular mental states like standing beliefs. So, and we tried to illustrate this by following the examples that Clarke and Chalmers talk about in their original paper, which Clarke summarizes and reiterates in chapter 9 of this textbook. For example, we looked at the Tetris example, and this was meant to be a kind of exercise, like a thought experiment, right? If somebody is mentally rotating the tetrazoids versus using epistemic action versus some kind of internalized epistemic action via some kind of cybernetic implant, to a Martian that has some kind of naturally evolved epistemic action, neural and bodily circuitry. Which ones seem cognitive, which don't? Which seem like extensions and which don't? The idea was for you to go through these on your own and kind of ask yourself, what seems to count as mental and what doesn't, and why, just to kind of get your intuitions pumping, right? Of course, after that, we introduced the Parity Principle, which basically says that if a part of the world functions as a process in some cognitive task the same way that, some kind of inner process would, then we should count that part of the world that functions as a process in the cognitive task as part of the cognitive system itself. And we really illustrated this with the example of Otto and Inga, right? Otto has a mild form of Alzheimer's, so he has a notebook. Inga relies on her inner resources, but it was argued that the traces in Otto's notebook form part of his cognitive system in that they serve as an external vehicle for his dispositional beliefs about where the museum is, in the same way that Inga's internal memory engrams work, basically. So that was the argument. We also talked about the extended mind in the context of research on gesturing. Gesturing, as we saw last time, seems to decrease the cognitive load in some way. And of course, there was a lot of material about gesturing in the book that I didn't actually cover. I kind of left you to read the rest of the gesturing subsection as well as box 9.4 on your own. But I will be returning to this idea of gesturing and talking about one idea that we didn't really get to last time. And this is the idea of cognitive turbocharging. So that will come up in one of the points of discussion. So we'll kind of quickly cover what we didn't cover with respect to gesturing later on in this lecture. So that is it for our recap. So we should all be nicely oriented to tackle the discussion section. And we're going to start with the first point. And the first point is entitled the auto two-step. So let's take a look at that now. So the auto two-step is a rebuttal that Clark and Chalmers consider toward their claim about Otto's notebook serving as a vehicle of his dispositional belief about where the Museum of Modern Art is. I believe 53rd Street, if I recall correctly, using my inner neural resources. So the rebuttal that they kind of, this is something that they say like, critics of our view might say something like this. This is one of their ways of getting ahead of some of these criticisms, right? So a critic of Clark and Chalmers' extended mind hypothesis might say that the notebook is not really a vehicle for a dispositional belief about the location of the museum for Otto. Really, all that's going on here is that Otto believes he has written the address in his notebook. He doesn't have a dispositional belief with respect to the location of the Museum of Modern Art. He just believes that the address for the Museum of Modern Art has been written in his notebook because he, automatically writes everything down, and he consistently uses the notebook in this way to encode and recall information. But he doesn't really have a dispositional belief about where the museum is. And it works something like this. Otto doesn't have any dispositional beliefs about the location of MoMA, but he's got a belief that its address is in his notebook, and this belief could lead him to look in his notebook, and this would in turn generate a belief about where the museum is located. And this is not a dispositional belief because Otto only believes it once he's looked in the book and kind of formed that belief, right? It's not a belief he had that he just had to recall or rehearse. It's a new belief that Otto forms when he checks his notebook. So that's the Otto two-step. It's not one dispositional belief that's kind of smeared out into Otto's notebook from his brain. It's a kind of two-step thing from I believe I have written the location in the book, leading to a desire, a sort of a chain of practical reasoning, if you like, a desire to look in the book, check the book, form a belief about where the museum is located. So he doesn't have a dispositional belief about the location of the museum. There's just this kind of chain of practical reasoning that happens because the only belief that Otto really has is that the location is written down in his notebook. So that's the Otto two-step, and that's kind of meant to be like a rebuttal against Clark and Chalmers, that they try and foresee and in turn rebut the rebuttal. How do they do that? Well, basically, they think that the reason this objection doesn't work is because we don't do the same thing when it comes to Inga, right? Just ask yourself real quick, why would we treat, the case of Otto this way in the Otto two-step? But why don't we depict, if we're going to do that, why don't we also depict Inga this way? Why isn't there an Inga two-step? Why don't we, depict her retrieving the information from biological memory and then forming a belief on that basis? Why isn't there an Inga two-step? Well, it would seem to Clark and Chalmers that this would add spurious complexity, as they say on page 201, to the case of Inga. It's an unnecessarily complex step that we don't have to take. Besides, just recall the parity principle here, right? And the parity principle is sort of meant to dispel our bio-chauvinism, right? Our chauvinism toward biological, neurological, naturally evolved kinds of things that we have that count as mental machinery, right? The parity principle is meant to dispel that. And if we apply it here, we see that Otto's situation passes that test, right? Also, Otto's notebook meets the 4 criteria we covered last time. It can be reliably and automatically accessed. just like Inga's biological memory engrams are reliably and automatically accessed. So we shouldn't really treat, at least with respect to what's a vehicle of thought and what isn't, we aren't really justified in treating Inga's biological resources any differently than Otto's notebook or vice versa. So we don't need to think of things in terms of stepping between beliefs about memories, whether they're biological or external traces, right? Clark and Chalmers basically think it's simpler just to treat the notebook as an extended vehicle, because, you know, you could make the same move here with Inga. You could perform a sort of Inga two-step, but that would just be weird and needlessly complicated. Well, Clark and Chalmers say it's weird and needlessly complicated to say that there's an Otto two-step. It's simpler. It's, I guess, a little clearer and more parsimonious just to say that Otto's notebook is a vehicle for some of his mental states. In this case, the dispositional belief about the location of MoMA. And you know, I guess I'm somewhat sympathetic to this. I mean, if we apply the parity principle and dispel our bio-chauvinism, right, or our bio-neural chauvinism, whatever, then yeah, functionally speaking, there really isn't much of a difference between what happens in the case of Otto and in the case of Inga. So there you have it. That is the Otto two-step and Clark and Chalmers' rebuttal to the Otto two-step. Now we move on to the mark of the cognitive, and this comes from Adams and Aizawa's response to Clark and Chalmers' extended mind hypothesis. We're going to come up against their work a few times today in this lecture. But the first one is all about this mark of the cognitive, which I mentioned last time. So let's get into the mark of the cognitive and how this figures into Adams and Aizawa's critique of the extended mind hypothesis. So as I mentioned a moment ago, Adams and Aizawa offer a number of critiques of the extended mind hypothesis. And part of the motivation for all of this is this demand that they have. The demand to identify or to explain, point to something that they call the mark of the cognitive. This is kind of related to an idea I talked about previously. Some of you, especially with a background in the philosophy of mind, may be familiar with Brentano's thesis. Franz Brentano was a 19th century thinker who identified intentionality as the mark of the mental. How do we know if something is a mental state or a conscious state? How do we distinguish these, special kinds of things from, non-mental physical states, for example? Well, mental stuff, consciousness, mental states, beliefs, conscious experiences, desires, all of this stuff is always about something. That was Brentano's mark of the mental, right? Adams and Aizawa want something similar when it comes to cognition, which here I take to mean, information processing, whether that's symbolic computation or something a bit more radical like connectionism or dynamics. Here we're talking about some kind of information processing. So what is the mark of the cognitive? The mark of the cognitive, as Clark says on page 201, would be an account of what makes it the case that some state or process counts as cognitive in the first place. So Adams and Aizawa want to identify this mark of the cognitive. Why? Because without an answer to this what question, what is it that makes a state cognitive or a system cognitive or whatever? Without answering this what question, we cannot settle the where question. The where question is, of course, where is the physical machinery that realizes a cognitive state or a cognitive process? Is it just in the head, as more traditional thinkers would argue, like Adams and Aizawa? Or is it kind of spread out into the world, like Clark or Chalmers would argue? We can't answer that question, Adams and Aizawa say, until we answer the what question. What is it that makes a state or process count as cognitive? Now, What do Adams and Aizawa suggest as a kind of candidate mark of the mental? Well, in their 2008 paper, which I believe you can find actually in the Cambridge Handbook of Situated Cognition, it is entitled "Why the Mind is Still in the Head" by Adams and Aizawa. There, they suggest, as a sort of candidate mark of the cognitive, the presence of non-derived representations governed by idiosyncratic kinds of processes. So, Otto's notebook wouldn't count here, and we'll see why in a moment. But just for now, Otto's notebook wouldn't count as a sort of extended cognitive vehicle because it involves derived meanings, meanings that are assigned by humans. You know, the arbitrary symbols that Otto writes with are given meaning by people. So those are derived representations and not non-derived representations, which here we might be talking about representations that are realized in the brain by particular neural firing patterns or brain states or something like that, right? So Otto's notebook would fail on that count, and it would also fail because Otto's notebook doesn't behave in the same way as the intraneural counterparts like Inga's memory engrams. They behave in an idiosyncratic way, a sort of way that is unique to brains, you know, if you're a type identity theorist, or unique to Inga's brain if you're like a token type identity theorist. Anyway, so that's the worry from Adams and Aizawa, and on their candidate mark of the cognitive, Otto's notebook would fail as an external vehicle for his dispositional beliefs. But what does Clark have to say in response to this? Well, let's talk about non-derived representations or non-derived contents, mental contents. Many representations or contents are present, Clark says, throughout the entire cognitive system, comprising neural resources and extraneural resources. So whether you count these extraneural resources as part of the cognitive system or not, there are certainly non-derived representations there, but they're also there in the world. So Clark thinks that the real question here concerns the acceptability of derived contents as elements in a cognitive process that also involves lots of non-derived representations or contents. And Clark's example, I admit, is a little bit unclear to me here, but I'm going to try to unpack it as best I can. You know, Clark thinks of manipulating like an Euler diagram or a Venn diagram in your imagination, right? You know Venn diagrams, they're those circles, those overlapping circles, and they describe set membership, you know? So you could have a large circle that denotes the set of fruits, for example, and you could have a smaller circle within that larger circle that comprises the set of apples. Right? That's a simple example. Conversely, you could have two circles that overlap. These two circles might represent together all edible vegetation. But of course, one circle might be fruits and one might be vegetables. I don't know, right? You see what I mean, right? Everybody knows about Venn diagrams. If you're not sure, just Google it. The point here is we can manipulate these in our imagination, and our thoughts have intrinsic contents. That is true, but they also inspect inner renditions of derived representations as well. What I think Clark is trying to say here is that the relations of set membership are non-derived, but whatever sets we're thinking about in our Venn diagrams are how we represent that may in some way be. You know what? Let me check the derived. So again, after a second read through, I'm still not really 100% clear on what Clark is trying to show here, because this is a complicated issue. But he seems to be saying that if you see a Venn diagram and then you try to manipulate it in your imagination, yes, you're using derived representations, but you're also going to have inner renditions of derived representations and thoughts that have their own intrinsic content as well. In any case, it's just not clear whether this derived or non-derived information or representations or contents is going to do the work here that Adams and Aizawa think it's going to do. Perhaps because the way derived and non-derived representations feature into our cognitive system, whether it is extended or not, just makes it a little too muddy to use as a mark of the cognitive. What about idiosyncratic kinds of processes? The kinds of processes that we find in the head, as it were. This is a little more clear. Clark is worrying, when Adams and Aizawa claim that there has to be non-derived representations that are governed by idiosyncratic kinds of processes, that they are basically just begging the question against proponents of the extended mind hypothesis. They're kind of subtly, sneakily trying to suggest that whatever goes on in the head ought to be the benchmark of what counts as cognitive. What does idiosyncratic mean? It just means inner in this way. Whatever idiosyncratic inner processes, they should count as our benchmark for what is cognitive. But that's begging the question, how do we know, how can we say for sure that cognition isn't extended? Well, it isn't like what goes on in the head. But that's just circular reasoning, right? That's the worry here. This is why Clark and Chalmers try not to frame their argument in a way where they're asking of extensions, how similar is this extension to what goes on in the head in terms of the process we're talking about. Rather, they try to ask of cognitive extensions, if this process were to go on in the head, would we count it as cognitive? The fact that Inga's dispositional belief is realized differently than Otto's dispositional beliefs doesn't matter. They have the same functional poise. So, we're coming back to these ideas of functionalism here. So we can ask and answer the second question, if this were to go on in the head, would we count it as cognitive, without even worrying about identifying a mark of the cognitive. So it's fair to say that Clark, and probably David Chalmers as well, are not too concerned with identifying this mark of the cognitive. We don't really need to do that, contrary to what Adams and Aizawa argue. All right, so let's move on to another of Adams and Aizawa's criticisms of the extended mind hypothesis. And this all centers around a fallacy that they call the coupling constitution fallacy. Basically, Adams and Aizawa reject what they would call coupling arguments for the extended mind hypothesis. They feel that these kinds of arguments for the extended mind hypothesis offer as evidence, that some kind of external process or cognitive tool or something like that is causally coupled with the cognizing agent, and that therefore this coupling, is constitutive of some kind of cognitive process. So basically they think the error is that because there is this organism environment coupling, extended minders take it too far and say, well, the cognitive process includes the organism and this sort of coupling loop that we've got. But they don't think that this holds in general. For example, and this is their own example, if we look at other kinds of physical processes like nuclear fission, when we split atoms, we bombard them with neutrons, we might bombard some uranium with some neutrons causing fission, and this would produce a lot of heat, and we use that to heat water to spin a turbine. Basically this is how nuclear power plants work, right? So we bombard some nuclei with some neutrons, and this causes nuclear fission, not fusion. Now, nuclear fission itself is actually constituted by the splitting of these atomic nuclei into smaller nuclei, right? But the bombardment of neutrons that causes this doesn't constitute nuclear fission. It is a cause of nuclear fission, but nuclear fission itself is constituted by the actual breaking up of large atomic nuclei into smaller atomic nuclei, right? Now, if we were to confuse the cause with the constituent, here if we confused the bombardment of neutrons or the bombardment of a nucleus with neutrons with nuclear fission, we would be committing the coupling constitution fallacy. And the worry is for Adams and Aizawa that arguments for the extended mind hypothesis commit the same fallacy. Now here Clarke points out that proponents of the extended mind hypothesis, or extended minders, as I've kind of been calling them off and on again, don't argue that just any old kind of causal coupling will do. You know, not any kind of causal coupling will count, is sufficient to count as an extension of cognition. Rather, extended minders like Clarke and Chalmers, their claim is that only certain couplings that result in the poising of external information for control in thought and action are what we think of as constituting part of a cognitive process. So it's not all kinds of couplings, it's only certain couplings, and what is key is that these couplings result in the poising of external information for the control of thought and action, which are still kind of in the head, if you like, or their locus is still in the head. The poising of information does real work here, you know. The coupling is a means to an end for the cognitive system as a whole. And Clarke thinks that coupling is best viewed as, you know, providing this kind of material link to support the exchange of signals, the exchange of information. And not as establishing facts about what constitutes what. So that is Clarke's response here. And this kind of response already works for neural explanations, right? I mean, if you think about it, we have our two cerebral hemispheres, right, in our brain. Our brain has a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. But we don't think of ourselves as having two brains. Not unless you are perhaps like a split brain patient and you've had your corpus callosum cut. Sometimes those people are talked about as if they have two brains. But for typical cases like you or I, we don't count our two cerebral hemispheres as two brains. We count them as one brain. Why? Because we have a dense and reliable exchange of information between our hemispheres, which is made possible by the corpus callosum, this big bunch of nerves that sort of serves as a bridge between the two hemispheres of the brain. Now, this is a kind of coupling which, whether you want to talk about constitution here or not, what constitutes one brain, one whole brain or not, that's kind of like not an important question for Clarke. What's important here is that the corpus callosum provides a material link to support the exchange of information. So we do this for neurological explanations. Why not do it for bioexternal systems that are kind of linked to or looped into the brain as well? Why not? Maybe it's our bio-chauvinism rearing its head again, right? So for our purposes, we're interested in the right kinds of coupling. Just to reiterate, we're interested in coupling that results in the poising of external information for the control of thought, choice, action, and so on. So the right kinds of coupling for Clarke that could count as cognitive would be like the kinds of coupling with things that we've talked about in the past few lectures, like wideware, notebooks, PCs, structures in the environment, embodied strategies like gesturing, things like that. So Clarke thinks that the worry about counting causes as constitutive parts that Adams and Aizawa have, that they try to highlight by talking about the coupling constitution fallacy are a bit misplaced. So much for the causal constitution or coupling constitution fallacy. I mentioned gesture as an example just a moment ago as the right kind of coupling. This would be like a brain-body coupling. And so this is a nice segue into the next point of discussion, which is all about worries about gesture. So before we get into this point of discussion, I'm going to quickly go over some of the things I did not go over last time with regard to gesture, and then we'll get into the actual worries about gesture. Okay, so let's take a look at that now. So one of the things that I didn't mention last time about gesture is that it might serve as a means of what we could think of as cognitive self-stimulation. Not just gesturing could work this way, but also other kinds of organism, environment couplings, wideware cognitive technology might work as means of cognitive self-stimulation. What is that? Well, basically, we'll lay out some concrete examples in a moment, but you can think about this as kind of like gesturing offers a way of, kind of like using representations in an embodied way, kind of offloading stuff into the body, and at the same time having the body and its movements make an actual positive contribution to the thinking process, to the process of cognition. Clark draws an analogy here between, gesturing and a turbo drive in your car. Okay, so I don't know a whole lot about cars, but my understanding of a turbo drive is basically that a turbo drive has exhaust from your engine, which drives a fan, okay? And this fan that's being driven by the exhaust coming out of the engine helps to suck more oxygen into the engine. Of course, more oxygen, mixed with gasoline and pressure and heat and whatnot, means more, oomph. It literally turbocharges your engine, right? So maybe gesturing is something like that. And again, once again, check out the end of the point of discussion on gesturing in the sketches section. And box 9.4 as well. So, Clark now asks, are there any worries about this conception of gesture as a kind of cognitive turbo drive? Well, it's possible. It's possible that gesture is not really working in this kind of turbo drive way. It's possible that neural resources are still doing most of the important work here. So maybe the ostensive benefits of gesturing are actually secured via some kind of covert inner neural route that we don't know about. And it just seems as though gesturing is turbocharging our cognition, if you like. So according to Ramachandran and Blakesley, cognitive neuroscientists, very cool stuff there, gesture is experienced by people born without arms. So people who just, congenitally happen to have not developed one or both arms. Now, this illustrates why this is a worry, because it could turn out that people born without arms also gain the cognitive bonus of gesture. People born without arms, after all, still experience gesture. It's like a phantom gesture, if you like. And if it turned out that people born without arms, or perhaps people who have lost an arm from an accident and who still experience phantom movement in their arm, if they got this cognitive bonus from gesture, even though they're not actually able to physically gesture, this would mean that the gesture bonus or the gesture turbo drive is actually obtained by some kind of inner route that we just don't know about. Similarly, you compare this to a case patient IW, as reported by Cole, Gallagher, and McNeil, 2002, quoted in Clark 2014 here. Patient IW was a paraplegic. He received an injury and could feel nothing below the neck, so he's got no feeling below the neck. And he also doesn't receive proprioceptive feedback from his arms, a feedback that tells him, where his arms are, what they're doing, so on and so forth. IW doesn't have that. Yet, IW produces these time-linked, non-iconic, expressive, gestures. So he received this injury, no proprioceptive feedback, no feeling, but he still kind of gestures in his own kind of way, even in conditions where we induce artificial blindness, so that IW can't see what his arms are doing. So we put a blindfold on him, he still gestures. And if it turned out that IW gained cognitive benefits in the artificially blind condition, he can't receive proprioceptive feedback. The only feedback he can receive is visual feedback. So we put a blindfold on him, and if he still, gets the benefits of gesture in absence of this feedback, that must involve a covert inner neural route. Maybe this inner route is along the lines of something like, like an efference copy. Remember we learned about the efference copy when we were talking about the robotic cricket. It could be some kind of premotor preparatory response in the brain. We don't know, right? That's why it's covert. But if it turned out that IW, or cases of phantom gesturing in, people born without arms or who have lost arms or other limbs, then that would be powerful evidence for this covert inner route. And that would give us cause to question whether it's gesture itself, the physical act of gesturing that secures these cognitive benefits, or whether it is just the inner route that secures these benefits. But, Clark says, these worries aside, this is an open empirical question, right? Gesture, for example, might arise out of the urge to express ourselves, and maybe that explains phantom gestures or IW's gesturing. But if physical gesturing confers a cognitive benefit, if it acts like some kind of cognitive turbodrive, then we wouldn't observe these benefits in cases like IW's or in cases of phantom gesturing. So this is all still very complicated stuff. And again, it's an open question. But, to clarify it, you can think of this example, which Clark lays out here. Imagine writing while thinking. There might be some cognitive benefit to writing while thinking. It might help our thinking to write things down, even if we couldn't see our hands moving, or even if we couldn't feel them moving, right? But the cognitive benefits would probably increase if we can feel our hands moving. They'd probably increase further if we can actually see what we're writing down as we're writing it. And if the traces persist for a long time, like in Otto's notebook, we might even gain further cognitive benefits. So, maybe gesture arises out of the urge to express ourselves, like an efference copy or a premotor kind of preparatory response in the motor cortex. And maybe there's some benefit to that. But there would be further benefits, arguably, from actually being able to gesture, or from actually being able to see what we're writing instead of writing in the dark or something, right? Each of these, we can imagine, adds another self-stimulating loop, adds another element of cognitive turbocharge, right? Now, we still need to investigate whether people in these, that are affected by these extreme cases, like congenital absence of limbs, losses of limbs, paraplegia in the case of IW and so forth, we still need to investigate whether people affected by these cases would gain the same benefits the same kinds of benefits that I would gain from writing where I can see and feel my hand moving versus writing in the dark, right? So it's an open question. It's not settled. All right, for our next point of discussion, which is busing brains and cognitive architecture, we're going to come back once again to one of the issues that Adams and Aizawa raise against the extended mind hypothesis. Now, Clark points out this is related to the coupling constitution fallacy, but it's a little bit less straightforward. Basically, Adams and Aizawa worry that extended minders are engaging in a kind of argumentative drift that goes from establishing some kind of causal coupling to the notion of a cognitive system, then to the view that that cognitive system extends outside of the head. Now, the worry here centers around this concern that not every part of an X performing system is part of the engine that performs X. And of course, in this case, X stands for cognition. So their example concerns like an air conditioning system, right? Like a big central air conditioner. An air conditioning system like this contains lots of things, the air conditioning unit itself, but also ducts, duct tape, and these kinds of things, right? Now, these are essential for the air conditioning system's success, but they aren't part of the air cooling mechanism itself, right? So, in the same way, bioexternal loops, organism-wide-wear couplings, organism-environment couplings, they're like the ducts and the duct tape. But the brain, the mind brain, is like the actual air conditioning, air cooling apparatus, right? Now, even some of the mental machinery in the head might fall on the wrong side of the divide here, according to Adams and Aizawa. There might be pathways in the brain that merely transfer information without actually processing anything, in the same way that the ducts in an air conditioning system merely transfer the cool air rather than actually cooling the air. So even these internal examples, examples in the brain, information buses basically, that simply move information around in the system but don't actually process or compute anything, wouldn't count as part of the engine of cognition, according to Adams and Aizawa, even though it's clearly part of the cognition performing system. So it's not just that, there are perhaps extraneural loops that are part of the system but not part of the cognitive engine. There might even be parts of the brain and systems in the brain that are part of the cognitive system but that are not part of the actual engine of cognition. This might sound a little weird, but think back to what we said about Herbert Simon a little while ago and Herbert Simon's view of memory. He thought of memory as a little more on the environment side and not on the organism side, even though memory is in the brain. And that's probably to do with his view of memory as storage. So this might sound a little weird. But anyway, the key thing here is that Adams and Aizawa, this worry causes them to postulate that mere information transfer, quote unquote, mere information transfer, doesn't ensure a system status as an element in cognition, right? It might be something that's important for the system to work, but it's not, part of the cognitive engine itself. But, as Clark points out, the corpus callosum, ostensibly one of these mere information transfer systems in the brain, it allows a very complicated two-way information flow between our cerebral hemispheres, and this information flow is crucial for many, many elements of human cognition. To suggest the corpus callosum is just mere information transferring device, like ducts in an air conditioning system, or that the corpus callosum is somehow cognitively inert, is just wrong-headed, according to Clark. And besides, what does it even mean to say, Clark asks, what does it mean to say that some neural systems are mere information buses? You'd think here, if you were to, not pay attention to any of Clark's rebuttals, if you just read Adams and Aizawa, you'd almost be tempted to think that mere information transfer is quite different from computation, that they're two completely different things. But Clark doesn't think that this distinction is really that crisp. This is actually quite an elusive distinction. It's possible, according to Clark, that information transfer is actually compatible with the notion of information processing significance. And we can see this if we look back a few lectures and we take another look at the recurrent neural networks that we talked about during my lectures on connectionism. Now, remember these networks, they differ from simple three-layer networks. You know, in a three-layer neural network, you have an input layer, a hidden layer, and an output layer. And they can do some interesting things. You know, they can classify images and stuff like that. They're very good at pattern recognition and whatnot. They can do some cool stuff. But there's a big difference between what these simple three-layer networks can do and what simple recurrent neural networks can do. Recurrent neural networks, if you recall, have an additional recurrent layer that kind of works as like a memory buffer, right? It remembers what happened in the hidden layer during the previous, previously, whatever the network was doing previously, such that what's going on in the recurrent layer will affect, future time steps in the network's processing. And in this way, we can actually do, different things with these networks that simple three-layer networks cannot do. We can model problems. We can model things like object permanence with these networks. We cannot do that with regular three-layer neural networks, right? So there's a difference between what these networks can do, but the recurrent layer doesn't really do much, right? It just remembers what happened previously in the network. Remembers, in air quotes. So very simple, but it makes a huge difference in terms of what these networks are able to do. It makes a difference in terms of the kinds of computations that we're able to realize or implement with these neural networks. So in the case of these neural networks, and in the case of recurrent neural networks, and in the case of the corpus callosum, mere information transfer, Clark says, seems to make a pretty big difference, cognitively speaking. And that is why he thinks that Adams and Aizawa's critique of the extended mind hypothesis is a little bit wrong-headed. And besides, all this aside, we've seen that we can also extend a lot of the ideas that Clark is talking about here beyond neural networks, beyond the corpus callosum, and apply it to an organism environment loops, cognitive technology, and so on, with no problem at all. So that is how Clark addresses this criticism. All right, now let's move on to the next point of discussion, integration and cognitive systems. So let us start this final point of discussion with a quote from Rupert, who says, "A state is cognitive if and only if it consists in or is realized by the activation of one or more mechanisms that are elements of the integrated set of members of which contribute causally and distinctively to the production of cognitive phenomena." That's from a 2009 publication of his. Find it on page 42. If you're interested, check out the extra reading section in Clark. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but basically, Rupert says that this view, that this kind of, the necessary and sufficient conditions he's trying to lay out here for what counts as cognitive, allows for a useful grip on the notion of cognitive phenomena. But he wants to go a little further than this, right? He thinks that this is not sufficient to establish where the boundaries of where one's cognitive states, cognitive processes, so on and so forth, actually are. So we have to go a little further than, simply saying that a state is cognitive if it consists in or is realized by, the activation of these mechanisms that are part of this set of members that distinctively and causally contribute to the production of things like mental states and so forth. We need to go further than that. What we need to do is carefully assess the degree to which a given state or process can be demonstrated to form an integrated and persisting set of mechanisms. An integrated and persisting set of mechanisms that, quote, contribute to the production of a wide range of cognitive phenomena across a variety of conditions, appearing as causally relevant elements in various overlapping collections of mechanisms of similar standing. From the same publication, from Rupert. What he's talking about here is like a kind of integrated cognitive architecture, right? If we could establish this, it might allow us to distinguish between that kind of cognition that is a natural kind, the kind of cognition that goes on in naturally evolved brains, for example, and cognition as only sometimes related, only sometimes cognition-related computation. The full quote is, cognition is a natural kind, and cognition, on the other hand, as, quote, only sometimes cognition-related computation, information flow, and dynamical interaction. So if we could kind of establish this notion of this cognitive architecture, according to Rupert, we could distinguish between cognition of the natural kind, or information processing as cognition of the natural kind, I should say, and information processing as only sometimes cognitive. And this sometimes cognitive information processing involves information flow, couplings, dynamical interaction, and the like, the extended mind stuff, really. Now, Rupert thinks that this option has a lot of advantages. He thinks that this option does a good job of explaining the data, the theory, and the experimentation of cognitive psychology in a way that still allows us room to explore all of the different ways that cognizers structure the environment or exploit the environment to achieve cognitive success. In other words, what's going on here is that Rupert's view, or the option that Rupert is trying to present here, combines conservatism about more traditional aspects of cognitive psychology, traditional approaches and methods and findings. It combines conservatism about cognitive psychology with the ability to accommodate yet new and exciting techniques and research results, like the kinds of things we've been learning in the latter part of this class. So Rupert is really, kind of trying to come up with a more moderate, less radical take on cognition spilling out into the world. He argues for something that he used to call the hypothesis of embedded cognition, rather than arguing for the extended mind hypothesis, right? So on the hypothesis of embedded cognition, typical cognitive processes depend on an organism's use of the environment in complex and often quite surprising ways. But he doesn't go full on extended mind and say that cognition actually is smeared out into the world. Cognition depends on a lot of extraneural loops and organism environment couplings and on wideware, but cognition itself doesn't extend into those things. The mind is still in the head, according to Rupert. Given this option, the option of the hypothesis of embedded cognition versus the extended mind hypothesis, Rupert thinks the embedded cognition hypothesis wins. He thinks it takes the cake. It wins because it fits within the more conservative aspects of cognitive psychology, how we've been doing it for the last few decades. But it also accommodates new data, new research findings, new research tools. It incorporates the new robotics, behavior-based robotics, dynamic systems theory, cognitive technology. All of this is still amenable to the hypothesis, or rather the hypothesis of embedded cognition is still amenable to all of these new ideas. It's just that they don't count as part of cognition. They merely support cognition, right? So, we can study these integrated systems within the context of existing cognitive scientific practice. And using what we learn, we can make sense of some other findings we've also obtained in existing cognitive practice. So Rupert is very much trying to carve out a sort of middle ground between the more conservative traditional approaches in the cognitive sciences and the more radical extended mind approach that we've been talking about up till now. But Clark questions a key move in Rupert's argument. He questions specifically the claim that studying integrated systems, these cognitive architectures, that studying these integrated systems, or that these integrated systems, I should say, are or should be the only target of cognitive psychological inquiry. By arguing this, Rupert is kind of setting up a kind of appeal to psychological conservatism, trying to make this a bit appealing to people who are kind of on the fence between a more traditional approach and the extended mind approach. But this move actually strikes Clark as a little bit premature. It might also restrict research into cognitive systems too, which would be bad. And I think Rupert would agree that if it ended up being restricted, that would be bad. So whereas Rupert thinks that the hypothesis of embedded cognition takes the cake, Clark thinks we should just cut our cake up using different theoretical and empirical approaches at the same time. To study, cognizers as situated and embodied agents means that we need to look at brain-body and organism-environment loops. And we can do that if we want to talk about cognitive extension or even just cognitive embedding. But if instead we only wanted to study what, embodied brains can do and not cognizers in a real environment, we could restrict the use of non-biological aids in our experiments if we wanted to, right? So if we wanted to study situated and embodied agents, maybe we give them a math problem and allow them to use a number of different tools, calculators, paper, pencils, so on and so forth. If we wanted to study what people could do without this kind of environmental cognitive scaffolding, we could just in our experiments, restrict the use of these aids so that our participants have to just use mental imagery or count on their fingers, perhaps. And if we wanted to know just what brains can do, we could restrict biological aids, like counting on your fingers. Or we could use transcranial magnetic stimulation to selectively deactivate areas of the brain if we wanted to look at just what brains can do. So we can really have our cake and eat it too, according to Clark, Rupert's argument is fine, but it might be too restrictive. Why not continue traditional approaches at the same time as new, more radical approaches? That might benefit cognitive science a little bit more, to kind of come at this from multiple approaches, to try to study cognizers from multiple approaches at the same time. All right, everybody, so that is it for Chapter 9. We've covered the discussion section. As mentioned, I have not covered the dessert section. But if you're curious, check that out on your own, and if you have questions, let me know. Next time, we will cover Chapter 10, which is a shorter chapter. However, like this chapter, which was also a little shorter, it is a dense chapter. I was hoping to make this lecture, or these two lectures on the extended mind, a little shorter than usual, and I have absolutely failed to do that. I will, however, be making the two lectures on our next topic, the topic of Chapter 10, shorter because we are running out of time. And I still want to talk about Clark's conclusion to this book and a little bit about consciousness for our final lecture. So for Chapter 10, I'm going to do my best to keep things short and sweet, and we're going to be talking about a view called enactivism. This is really cool. This is, thinkers like Evan Thompson, Alva Noe, Kevin O'Regan. These are big champions of this enactivism view. And basically on enactivism, perception isn't this sort of passive process. Perceiving is something that we actively do. It's not something we passively do. It's something that we enact, right? So that's what we're going to cover, and this will be the final full chapter that we cover from Clark. After that, we'll just cover not really a conclusion and the appendix on consciousness. So that is it for today. Be sure to let me know if you have any questions, and remember, your final critical response is coming due soon. I've actually given a small extension for this. It was initially due on the 4th, but I've decided to make it due at 11:59 p.m. on the 6th. And that is because some of you have reached out to me letting me know that you'd like to write about the extended mind hypothesis. And I thought that it would be best if I got both of these extended mind lectures done before any of you went and wrote on that. So now that I'm finished, and I'm going to go upload this and edit it, upload it, get it up there for all of you. Now you'll be able to do that if you want to. Okay? Otherwise, let me know if there are any other questions, concerns about any of the material I've covered, or about your upcoming essay assignment. I'll do my best to help. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy out there, and I will see you next time for our lectures on enactivism. Bye for now, everyone.